So the first thing I want to present to you is the World Food Hunger Map. This has been produced many times over many years, and this is the 2015 edition coming out of the World Food Programme. So what it does is it highlights different parts of the world, and you can see some parts of the world, particularly the parts in Eastern and Southern Africa, where we have a whole set of issues associated with hunger, malnutrition in terms of protein and energy, but it also exists in our part of the world here in terms of Asia, in particular a couple of countries, as well as, of course, Afghanistan. So the point of this map is not to say, well, all is bad, but it's also not to say that all is good, because we're talking here about 800 million people. Now, as a proportion of the world's population, the number of people in this World Hunger Map has changed and dropped dramatically over the last 25 years. It was approximately 30-odd% of people. It's now around 11%. So that's the good news, folks. The bad news is the absolute number hasn't fundamentally changed. It's gone up and down and varied, and there are particular peaks, particularly in the food price hikes that we had in 2007, 2008, where it actually bumped up by close to 100 million people. But it's running around 800 million people. So that is a concern. It's a concern in 2015. And as we go forward, and that's the challenge for us, the challenge is not just today, in 2015, the challenge is next year, the challenge is 2020, the challenge is 2030, the challenge is 2050 and beyond. We need to make sure that the number of people, as well as the proportion, declines. And the point that I'll be raising and focusing on here today, it's not just about food availability. We know about access, utilization, and stability. It's also about how that food is produced. In other words, it's the sustainability issues. And the sustainability issues will be more magnified as we go forward into the future. So what we do today and how we produce our food, how we use the water, how we use the energy that we have is fundamental to our future. And it's fundamental to the people who are in this hunger map today, the 800 million people or so. And it'll be fundamental to the people who will be in that hunger map, whatever that hunger map is, in 2050. So that's a challenge. That's the challenge on the food side. There's a challenge on the water side. So this is a map from about a decade ago. It wouldn't have fundamentally changed. It looks at water stress. This is a water stress in terms of how much of the runoff that's available in those particular countries is actually extracted. And in many of these places, Australia, India, North Africa, Western United States, the principal source of that water extraction is in fact agriculture. So there's an absolute connection between agriculture, food production, food security, water stress, water security. They're absolutely, totally connected. So what I showed you before was about annual runoff. Obviously, water has a hydrological cycle. It can come and it goes. This looks at groundwater, and of course groundwater can be replenished as well as recharge rates in terms of groundwater. So this looks at different parts of the world, and these maps here basically represent areas. So these gray areas represent the footprint in terms of groundwater extraction. Okay, so approximately 1.7 billion people on our planet are in locations where the aquifers are being used in a way that it's not sustainable. So there again, it's another issue that we have to face. It's not just the runoff that's coming in terms of streams, in terms of rivers. There are some very substantial rivers, of course, here, the Ganga flowing down through India and Bangladesh, and of course the Indus up here in terms of Pakistan. They're not only the rivers issues, there's a groundwater set of issues. So that's another formidable challenge. Not insurmountable, but it is a formidable challenge in terms of connecting the issue of water security, food security, and actually doing something about it. This screen is deliberately blank for absolute purpose to just have us stop and think what I've just shown you. Okay, we've looked at several maps about global water, global hunger, hidden hunger, global water stress, global footprints in terms of groundwater extraction. We don't just, I believe, leave them behind. We don't just collect information. We don't just use it for show and tell at fancy meetings. We need to make a difference. We need to make that go away, or at least get mitigated in a variety of ways. And I think that's what we should be doing. That's why this talk is about actions. It's not just about problems. It's about solutions. It's about actually responding to these sets of issues. So what I show you here is an annual food price index. And it highlights the recent risks that have been identified. And I'll just go through this. You can go back to the 1990s, and of course that's where this index starts, and it goes back to the 1970s. And we see a secular decline in food prices, getting underway post the food crisis in 1973. And that was a function of a great deal more supply coming in terms of food production, essentially from the Green Revolution and the various things associated with it. And I think over the period of time, certainly by the 1990s, there was a complacency that began to set in, that somehow or other we had dealt with the problems. Malthus was wrong. Technology will solve this for us. Full steam ahead. We got a very, very nasty shock. And what was the last so-called food crisis? 2007, 2008. Okay, so this looks at the cereal price index as well as a food price index. It's a world food price index, so it has a whole bunch of things in terms of when you do the aggregation, but it clearly shows rapid increases, okay, over a relatively short period of time, which of course had a response in terms of hunger. This led to tens of millions of more people being on that hunger map as a function of those food prices. We may not have noticed it in the West, in the context of rice. We're paying a little bit more for rice. But somebody whose family budget is 60% on rice, this makes a huge difference when the price of rice is doubled, tripled, or quadrupled. So this is the trend that went up, went down, and then went up again, okay? And has come subsequently down. This doesn't just happen by chance. This is not some random sorts of events that they just happen by happenstance. There are reasons behind those food price shocks. Those reasons are in part related to policies, decisions that people made, decisions that were taken back in the 90s and the 2000s, in particular in terms of biofuels production, which contributed in terms of these price hikes. About 20% of that price hike is associated with biofuels subsidies and support, not an insignificant amount. 40%, more than twice the responsibility, I suppose, of biofuel subsidies, was in fact the oil price. Energy prices are very much drivers of what happens to food prices. So if you have a look here, this is from a paper that I did with Hang To. You can see a relationship here between oil prices and crude oil prices and a world food price index. So of course, today in 2015, the price of oil, crude oil is down at $50-odd a barrel, is a low prices relative to where they've been in the last few years. Things start to look pretty rosy. But if you want to look at long-term forecasts in terms of crude oil prices, they're not expected to stay at $50 a barrel. They're expected to be higher than that. I don't know what they'll be in 2025. I don't know what they'll be in 2030. The point is that energy prices are drivers in terms of food prices. It's something that's critically important. It's something, again, connecting food, water. In this context, it's energy, the food, energy, water, so-called nexus. And thinking about decisions that we make today, biofuel subsidies, to supposedly address CO2 emissions. And in fact, there's a whole literature now showing that in fact it doesn't address CO2 emissions, but that was the perceived, or at least the stated intent, has had a big impact in the context of food prices and therefore hunger. There's a whole set of connected issues and the risks associated with that. Hopefully I haven't painted too gloomy a picture. I hopefully painted a picture of a world that needs fixing, but it can be fixed. I think that's the point that I want to emphasize. So I'm going to talk through some responses. This is not in any way an exhaustive review of the sorts of responses that are possible. It's obviously across a whole set of issues: food, energy, environment, water. It's institutional, it's governance, it's crop breeding. It's the whole. It's a very, very large set of responses that are required. I'm going to focus in on the set of responses that the people working with me and our group, the Food, Energy, Environment, Water Network, that's what FE2W stands for. When we were formed, we got together in June last year, in June of 2014. launched ourselves in November of 2014 and ongoing today in 2015. And so one of the things I'm going to highlight is the issue of risk. So I've already pointed out the global risks, but let's just go into some nitty-gritty issues about how people make decisions when they face risks, okay? So this is a vanilla flavored version in terms of risk assessment and risk assessment tables. And these are the typical sorts of things that are used around the world at both private business and in the public sector. Okay, so how does it work? Well, risk is defined as likelihood or probability multiplied by consequence. That's typically how it's defined. And so you have likelihoods here, so almost certain, likely, possible, unlikely, rare. And you have along here on the horizontal axis consequences, insignificant all the way to catastrophic. Okay, so the point of this table is you start to say, well, hang on, what are the threats that we face and where would they fit in terms of these cells? Okay, so it's a no-brainer. If it's catastrophic consequence with almost certain to happen, well, you press the panic button, I suppose. That's clearly high. You know, it's it's red, so not a problem. This will clearly identify that's a high risk, and you should do something about it. That's fine. It works. Okay. Conversely, if it's insignificant minor risk and unlikely rare, and it's significant and minor consequences, yeah, well, we can think about that tomorrow. We don't have to worry too much about it. So there again, it's helpful in the sense of prioritizing what you need to do. The problem with this table is this area here. Okay, catastrophic, but rare. Okay, so we don't have experience in dealing with these situations. And the problem with this table, catastrophic and rare, the way these tables are typically done, you go over here. Oh, that's just the same thing as a minor consequence that's almost certain. It's complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. Because the almost certain, we're familiar with those. Those events that happen on a regular basis, they're relatively minor. We manage them, we deal with them, we face them, we do. That's not the same thing as a catastrophic that's rare. Because when they hit, we're in serious, serious trouble. And we need to plan for them and plan for them very well. And typically, we don't. And so the problem with this table is it doesn't deal with this corner here at all. And it also doesn't deal with how we go from triggers to these risks, okay, in terms of events, and what we need to do about them. And so this is I'm going to quickly show the sorts of things we can think about it. You can think about a system, a food system, or whatever it is, global food production, whatever it be. It doesn't have to be, it could be anything you want it to be, but it's some system performance. And then some trigger happens. Perhaps it's an El Nino event. You know, perhaps it's a cyclone event. Whatever it is, something happens. Okay, and so there's a trigger point. And then we have uncertainties about what that will lead to in terms of system performance. It's clearly negative in this case. System performance is declining, but they were uncertain about it. And obviously, ideally, we'd want our system to bounce back, okay, following that trigger, that nasty, unpleasant event. And if it doesn't, then we become more vulnerable. And that's where the poor, of course, figure in. If we're talking about global food systems, they're going to be particularly vulnerable, okay, if we have less food, higher food prices. They're the ones that are going to suffer. So how do we think about it in the context of risk? Well, you can think about, here's the trigger. You want to do something ahead of time. Okay, that's what we're talking about today in terms of food, energy, and water. We want to do something in 2015 before really the real problems arise down the road. So we need to think about how we do better decision making and get better outcomes. Okay, and so then the trigger hits, whatever that particular event might be, drought, flood, whatever. We'll have controls in at that point. And then hopefully we'll have mitigants, some way of helping people or the systems that get damaged. Food aid is the sort of thing that could happen there, but it's not a solution in the context. We should have done things ahead of time. And of course, we would want to be able to have systems that would be resilient, that would allow us to bounce back with the shocks. So suppose energy prices were to rise, would we be able to deal with it? How would we deal with it? What were the sort of things that we would need to do? That's the sort of thing that needs to happen in causal risk and resilience. So I can go back and just highlight 3 discourses that are out there. So what we're doing as a group is trying to put in ideas, and there's lots of ideas out there, okay? There's lots of people thinking about this. So we've sort of looked at 3 discourses, and they're all connected to other discourses. One is sustainable intensification. This is a term that came out of the food crisis of 2007 and 8, the perfect storm, the work that was done there, what we can do about it. It's the idea of producing more food from the same or less inputs. The Nexus, which I will show you very shortly, it's connecting food, energy, environment, and water, seeing the connections, the systemic risks. And then resilience thinking, which I've just shown you, is looking at how systems perform after negative shocks, after the sorts of things that are unexpected. How can we plan for that? How can we manage that? And those are all 3 discourses that all have value, and we try and incorporate them in the context of our risk and options and assessment for decision making. So here's a view of the Nexus. There are multiple pictures of the Nexus, but clearly there are drivers that are affecting indirectly and directly what's going on in terms of food, energy, environment space. And of course, there's a whole set of sustainability outcomes. We're moving to these sustainability goals getting underway very shortly. Those are the sorts of things we need to be thinking through, how we can actually deal with these sets of issues and risks to get the outcomes and goals, meet those goals that are planned under, through the UN processes. So let me just start to close the presentation by just looking at a process that we have in mind. Now, I want to emphasize there are multiple processes, frameworks, decision support systems out there. They're manifold. There are many, many of them. We just don't think that any of those processes fully look at the risks, the systemic risks that we've talked about, that I presented to you right now. And we think that there's a process that should be followed. And what we've tried to do is pull together those 3 discourses, pull together other ways of thinking. We don't think it's rocket science. We think this is straightforward, what needs to be done in terms of how to improve decision making. So let's just go through this. So the first one is an obvious one, is to think about the scope of the problem, the risks, the opportunities, the stakeholders, how participatory processes in that. I think that's an obvious thing. Most frameworks will have that. Next, you want to think about the threats and the triggers, so a threat and risk assessment type of view of the world. Next, you want to think about the sorts of things I've talked about in terms of causal risk and opportunities and how to respond to those. So in other words, think about what those threats are. There's multiple threats. Think about the triggers. Think about the events that they generate. Think about those consequences. And then, of course, you then need to respond to that. That's the issue about risk equaling likelihood times consequence. A table doesn't tell you what you should do. It doesn't indicate the controls and actions required. So this is the part of this process here. You go through your causal model and you think about the actual actions required, the controls, the mitigants to address and respond to those risks, okay, and take that into account. And of course, like any process, it needs to have appropriate implementation and review, so there's some back to this. It can be viewed as a linear process, but it's an iterative process, and it could be back and forth at different places. So the point of it is flexible. It's entirely flexible. A farmer could use this in the Punjab, or a water ministry could use it. It's scale independent in that sense. What you put in it, however, is not scale independent. There'll be places where this causal risk and opportunities assessment could be very, very detailed. Okay, a whole bunch of conditional probabilities, a whole bunch of threats. It could be a very detailed process. For a farmer, it might be just simply a back of the envelope type review. Regardless, it's a helpful process to move us forward to get better decisions. So we as a group, the Food, Energy, Environment, Water Network, we've got 6 basins in the world that we've targeted to look at and apply ROAD, risk and options assessment for decision making. And we will be having a Bellagio workshop in February 2016, okay, funded through the Rockefeller Foundation, and we'll be focusing on the Ganges-Brahmaputra-Meghna Basin and the Mekong Basin. We currently have plans to try and do some testing of the ROAD process in New Zealand this year. We're looking for funding, and we'll be applying for funding to look to applying it both in the Mekong and in the Ganges over the next few months. So that's where we're heading. Understand risks. To us, it's all about risks and responding to those risks with decision makers and obviously generating actions so we get better outcomes to deal with the risks that the world currently faces.